So we're moving on to question 1 in our attempt to make faith a verb and help us to determine how we ought to behave in challenging situations. So our question number 1 is, what is going on? What is happening here? Seems pretty basic on the face of it. Just tell me what's happening. Describe the situation. But it's a little bit more challenging than we think at first, because of, I think, primarily that penchant for interpretation that we talked about last week, that humans are natural interpreters. So when I tell you a story about something that has happened to me, I am interpreting it as I tell it to you. I am giving particular details and leaving some things out that I don't think are important. I am perhaps inserting additional background information to help you to frame the story in the way that I want you to. So for example, I could tell you, well, yesterday I was in my backyard and I was walking across and I was distracted. I was looking at the one tree just seemed like it was a little bit off. And so I was looking at the tree and I was walking across the backyard and I stepped in a hole. And now that hole wasn't there yesterday, but one of my chickens must have dug it and I twisted my ankle in the hole. All of that information that I just gave you is me attempting to justify to you why I stepped in the hole, so that you won't think, gosh, what a klutz, Katie stepped in a hole. You'll think, you'll have sympathy for me. You'll say, oh, well, it's not her fault. It wasn't there yesterday and she was distracted by the tree and all these different things. And so even in the telling of a story, we are already interpreting, we're already attempting to shape it so that the person who's receiving it interprets it in a particular way. And you all, as I was telling that story, were also interpreting. You were probably coming to conclusions about why I'm telling you this story, about where the story is going, even from the very first sentence. And so it's hard to do just this first task, this descriptive task, just describing a situation and what's going on within the situation, because we tend to just jump straight into already judging, already interpreting, already deciding the conclusion before we even get to the end of the story. And then the other side, I think that brings a challenge, is that sometimes when people are telling you, what's going on and describing something to you, they're not really telling you what's really going on. I might get up in the morning and I might be in a really bad mood. I didn't sleep very well last night. Oh, there she is.
Sorry.
Hi, Pam.
Hi. I've been trying to manage getting onto the national convention, and it's just been taking my mind all over the place.
Okay, that's fine. We're just getting started. I'm just kind of describing a little bit about our first question that we're going to talk about today, which is what is going on. And I mentioned that it's a little bit more challenging than it is on the face of it. You think that describing something, just looking at it and describing it, is a fairly simple task, but there are some challenges to it. So I'm talking about the second challenge here, that we're not always even sure for ourselves what's really going on. So I might wake up in the morning and I might not have slept well last night. I might be in a really grumpy mood. I might still be upset because, I don't know, my baseball team lost last night. And so I get up and I go into the kitchen and I start making some toast and I forget about my toast and my toast burns. And I just lose it. I start yelling and screaming and cursing at this toaster. And of course my husband comes in and says, oh, what's wrong? And I say, oh, this stupid toaster burned my toast. Well, if he's asking me to describe the problem, I just said, the toaster burnt my toast. But is that really what's going on here? No. It's much more complicated than that. And so sometimes it's hard to describe a situation, especially when there are other people involved, and you're trying to help them or trying to engage with them, because sometimes they don't even know what's really going on. They are focusing on a particular symptom of the problem, but they don't themselves have the capacity, because they're angry or frustrated or just so far into the situation that they can't take a step back and kind of see the little bit of a bigger picture. And so between that side of things and our penchant for immediately interpreting and judging and deciding what's going on from the very beginning, it can be quite a challenge to describe. I came up with this kind of fun little activity for us to think about, to give some examples of this. These are all tweets from Twitter that I found, and they, for the most part, have 2 sentences. And I'd like to just read some of these to you to kind of illustrate this point that I'm trying to make about how we are natural interpreters and we start to form our opinions with very little information. So the first one is actually just 1 sentence, but it's got 2 parts. If I got $1 every time I thought about you, I would start thinking about you. Second one, I asked if I could switch seats on the plane because I was sitting next to a crying baby. Apparently, that's not allowed when the baby is yours. My husband just opened the car door for me. It would have been nice, except we were going 70 miles an hour down the highway. After experiencing a 15-game losing streak, the San Francisco Giants visited an orphanage in Brazil today. It's heartbreaking to see their sad little faces with no hope, said Jose, age 6. So these are, what I guess we would call kind of non sequiturs, or, they upturn our expectations. And they're funny, they're jokes, because they prey on our automatic interpretational response to anything that we hear. So, if I had a quarter for something, I would have a lot of quarters. But instead it's, oh, if I got $1 every time I thought about you, I would probably start thinking about you. Or if the team is going to the orphanage and the person who's telling the quote, it's heartbreaking to see their sad little faces with no hope, our assumption is that one of the baseball players is saying that about the kids, not the kids saying it about the baseball player. So we automatically start to interpret the second we get any information. So we have no information other than this tiny little sentence. My husband just opened my car door for me. We start to make a mental picture of what that looks like. They're in a parking lot. He's gotten out of the car. He's walked around to open the door. Isn't this a sweet, chivalrous gesture? Well, it would have been nice had we not been going 75 miles an hour down the highway. So it completely takes us out of those assumptions and forces us to think a little bit more about how we do assume, how we start to interpret and judge and come to conclusions on what people are saying to us before they've even gotten 1 sentence out. So how do we get around that? It's impossible. You can't. But the best thing that we can do is, in moments when we come up short, those moments when we don't know what to do about a situation from our gut or from our heart, or it's a little bit more complicated than just being able to quickly assimilate or accommodate a new piece of information, we first have to be aware of some of our biases, and not just not using the word bias in a negative way, but the things that we bring that are going to be helpful or harmful, like we talked about last week, that depending on the situation, a particular experience that you've had, a particular position you have, might help you or it might get in your way, depending on what the situation is. So one of the things that I think is a helpful thing as we come to listening, either if we're listening to another person and helping them, or listening to ourselves and our own circumstances and trying to decide what we're going to do to respond faithfully to the world around us, is to be aware of what is our priority, what is of the most importance to us generally. And so that's that theological rocks thing. So I wanted to see if anybody would like to share some of what they were thinking about this week in relationship to their theological priorities. What is the most important thing to them when it comes to coming to a situation from a theological position?
Well, I thought all week about what was a theological rock for me, and two things stood out. One, the rock itself is that God is always with us. That is what I try to bring into every situation. Well, but God is here in this moment, And two things that made me realize that was so important to me. One was when my parents were divorced when I was 6, and when I was grown and married and had a grandchild, my father's family had a reunion, and we went, and I had never been real close to them, and they did a memorial service on one day of the reunion. They did a memorial service with for my father and his sister, who had both passed. And my aunt read the scripture from Romans about how nothing can separate us from God. And it just had a profound impact on me that I can't even describe it. So that was the first thing that made me think about that. But then the other thing is that there's a series of books that I read, and I was reading one of them, and it was about a young woman who had been murdered by being pushed off a bridge. And the phrase that this other woman said to her father was, "Between the bridge and the water, I was there." And I had always thought about God being near us when, like I worked with hospice, so when somebody is sick and they die, it's a natural thing. And I'd always thought about God being there and God being with us on a daily basis. But I hadn't thought about it in terms of a death that was violent, like a car crash or something sudden like that, But then you have to realize that, yes, he is always there. So whenever I'm faced with a situation, I try to think of, well, that phrase "between the bridge and the water" pops into my head now, but it's like, okay, so where is God in this situation? And I'm having a tough time with that right now, with everything that's going on in the world. And I know that it's true, and I'm hanging on to that, but it's tough. It's really tough to always remember that is your rock,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I never know if I make sense or not, because I go all different directions.
Yes, thank you for sharing that, Karen. Anybody else want to share some of their thought process with theological rocks?
Well, mine, I had almost exactly the same thing as Karen as one of mine. I have one God only and present.
Yeah.
Okay, I've wrestled with God all my life through many major rocks, as we seem to call them, and the first one was the hardest, because each one of them dips you down into the darkness, and you have to try to find a source of light. in that darkness. The first one was when I was a junior in college at Concordia Seminary. And I met and fell in love with this student nurse at Barnes Hospital. And we worked together through hospice situations because I was there as an orderly. We had to do compulsory work there. And so we worked together and we both fell in love. But the more we got to know about each other, we knew it couldn't last and it couldn't be. Primarily because I was a seminarian and she was from a very strong Catholic family, and we just knew that it was not going to go. And that was a traumatic time that caused many questions in my theology about what God was doing. But it has worked out for the right and the positive, and we both decided just to walk away. And ever since that big one, I've been able to handle most everything in my life as little rocks, because I've come down to the feeling that I have a primary theology. Christ died for me, for my sins, and took my sins to the cross. That's primary. Everything else, I don't worry about. I have no worries about anything else because it's all secondary in my life. And so I find that I become closer to God and my Lord by personalizing him. God is not my father. God is my daddy. He's my daddy. I have faith in him like a child has faith when her daddy throws her up into the air. I have faith that I'll be caught again. That's a childlike faith. And that's the faith I think that I subscribe to, and I recommend everybody. Just get a childlike faith. Don't get so involved in theology that it messes up your faith. And that's basically where I come from as far as new theologies goes. I'm an old man and I'm very set in my ways. And you could probably call me closed-minded too, because it's not that I'm closed-minded, it's just that the other things, they don't mean, as my dad used to say, a hill of difference to me. So that's where I'm coming from.
So your central priority is that faith statement that Christ has died for me.
Yes, that's my primary. He died for me, took all my sins with him, and allowed me to put a beautiful white blanket over the top of me so that when God looks down at me, he doesn't see my sins, but he sees this blanket that Jesus has placed over me. And everything else is, as I say, secondary to me, because I found when we would argue, or not argue, but when we discuss faith in college, and we discussed quite a bit of faith at the time, because that was when Seminex was starting in the Missouri Synod. We discovered that we could logically move one person into a situation where they had to agree with us that this theology needs to be changed and can be changed. But emotionally, that person never believed. We would turn and walk away and say, well, you got me that A equals C, but I still don't believe. And so that's why we can begin to look at this. I begin to look at this as faith as an emotional characteristic in our body, that emotion plays a major, major part in it. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Yeah, sure. And you know, I don't think that we're trying to turn faith into a formula here. You know, I think I want to be very careful to make sure that nobody comes away from this with that understanding, because certainly there is central to faith is the experience of God. Central to faith is the encounter that we have with God, whether that for one of us is that, one time kind of road to, like Paul encountering God, the one with this huge epiphany and everything changes for you, or whether your experience of God is something that you encounter God again and again in worship or in a particular song or in prayer. That is the primary place that our faith comes from. God, faith is a gift. Our ability to believe and to act on that belief is always a gift from God. And we believe that God's grace gives us that ability. But as we navigate the world and come across challenging circumstances, it's my belief that God gives us tools to address those challenges. And so, like I said, this process that we're talking about here is not something that you're going to do on a daily basis necessarily. You're not going to come up to the McDonald's drive-through and look at the menu and say, all right, do I want a chicken sandwich or do I want a burger? Well, let me start with question number 1. What is going on here? Question number 2, why is this going on? Question number 3, what should be going on? You're not going to do that. But when you have those experiences of coming up short, when the past experiences of God, when your past experiences of acting on your faith, of living out your faith, are not enough for you to just kind of automatically be able to process and know how to respond, this is very helpful. And I think even just the process of thinking about these things, even if you never use these questions in a systematic way, and even if you don't ever use this tool formally, I think, the thinking through why you believe certain things and how those things impact other aspects of your belief, thinking about what is it that is central to my faith, so that when you come across situations, you can keep that in mind a little bit more easily. You can understand who you are a little bit better. I think all of those things are part of our growth in faith, our growth as Christians. God wants us to know God, and God also wants us to know who we are in relationship to God. And understanding who we are deeply, I think, is something that God desires for us, not just because it helps us, to know God better and to understand what God has done for us better, but it also assists us in fulfilling our calling in the world. It helps us to be better, whatever it is that we're asked to be, better hospice workers, better teachers, better toothpaste tube lid screwer honors, whatever it is that we do with our lives. If we understand better who we are as individuals and how we respond to the world and how our experiences have impacted us, then we can lean into our calling with more vigor, because we have less to fear about losing who it is that we are at our core, at our essence, because we understand what that core is, what that essence is better, because we've thought about it. And so I'm certainly not asking you to give up your feelings of faith. I'm not asking you to logic your way out of a particular position. What I'm hoping to do is to give you additional tools for deepening your understanding of that faith, and for addressing what's happening in your life when those moments do come up that you come up short.
Good.
Just adding to the toolbox, I hope. So just for a little bit here, what I'd like to do, because I do want to spend some time allowing all of you to share stories if you feel comfortable doing that, but I don't want that to be on the recording. I don't think that that's appropriate for us to put that out there. So before we do that, I just wanted to look quickly at a little bit of the Bible and some examples of this descriptive task in the Bible. And even I am going to pull one of my Bibles off the shelf here. Rather than just use my online, because I think context is important for this task of describing. And I'd like to look first at Mark chapter 11. Verses 12 through 25. Somebody like to read that for us?
You said 11 through chapter 11?
12 to 25.
Okay. You saying this is the one where Jesus is in the clearing the temple out?
Yeah, so we're going to start with verse 12.
Okay. I can read half of it.
Okay, sounds great.
Okay. I'm using NIV.
Okay.
Okay. It says, the next day they were leaving Bethany. Jesus was hungry. Seeing in the distance a fig tree in leaf, he went to find out if it had any fruit. When he reached out, he found nothing but leaves, because it was not the season for figs. Then he said to the tree, may no one ever eat fruit from you again. And his disciples heard him say it. On reaching Jerusalem, Jesus entered the temple area and began driving out those who were buying and selling there. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the benches of those selling doves, and would not allow anyone to carry merchandise through the temple courts. And as he taught them, he said, it is not written, my house will be called a house of prayers for all nations. Oh, is it not written? Excuse me. My house will be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you have made it a den of robbers. The chief priests and the teachers of the law heard this and began looking for a way to kill him, for they feared him, because the whole crowd was amazed at his teachings. When evening came, they went out of the city. You want me to keep going or just somebody else read it?
If you don't mind, we're just going to 25, so it's just 5 more verses.
Okay. I'll go for it then. In the morning, as they went along, they saw the fig tree withered from the roots. Peter remembered and said to Jesus, Rabbi, look, the fig tree you cursed has withered. Have faith in God, Jesus answered. I tell you the truth. If anyone says to this mountain, go throw yourself into the sea, and does not doubt in his heart, but believes that what he says will happen, it will be done for him. Therefore, I tell you, whatever you ask for in prayer, believe that you have received it, and it will be yours. And when you stand praying, if you hold anything against anyone, forgive him, so that your Father in heaven may forgive your sins. Somehow there was a 26 in there that I missed.
Oh, there's no 26.
So yeah, this is an interesting one. Verse 26 does not exist in chapter 11 of Matthew, or Mark, sorry. There is an insertion, there was an insertion in the Middle Ages that they then started to copy over as if it were part of the text, and then they realized that it was an insertion, and so they took it out. So there is no verse 26 in chapter 11 of Mark. Interesting little
Yeah, I'm like, uh-oh, I went too far. Thank you. Learn something.
Yeah. All right.
There's 26. It does?
Like no
That's got
no 13th floor in your hotel, so that people don't have to stay on the 13th floor. So let's practice our. What's that, Pat?
I was just going to say mine has the insertion.
Oh, does it? Interesting.
Or the Bible,
So,
But it's in parentheses and indicated as such.
oh, okay. Okay. So let's try to do some of this descriptive task with this passage. What is going on here?
I don't know. I don't understand it. I don't know why Jesus would cause the thing to freeze up when it wasn't even in season.
Yep.
He should
Yeah.
have known better. But I don't get it.
So the descriptive
And
task.
you should see, you
So
should
the-
see my fig tree, it's loaded.
So the descriptive task calls us to try to at least do our best not to start interpreting. So we just say, well, Jesus was walking down the road and he saw a fig tree and he walked up to it and there was no fruit on it, so he cursed it. What? Why?
Why?
So
Because it was 110 in the shade. I don't know. And he was out of sorts.
The question is what does Jesus intend by saying that? What does he want the outcome to be? Or
Is that the third thing? I mean, like in the process?
yeah. So we're supposed
Instead
to
of
stop
asking
and we're
why.
supposed to describe what is happening here. Well, we need to notice that, at least the way that this episode is portrayed in the story, that there's this really important activity in between the two encounters with the fig tree. And so if we notice that, because we're trying to observe, we're trying to describe, we're not trying to automatically interpret, then that might change our interpretation. So it's possible, if you're just looking at it on the face, that Jesus was in a really bad mood and he was hungry and thirsty and wanted a fig and he got really angry, and because he has the ability to do it, he curses this fig tree because he's just mad. He's in a fit of pique. He decides that he's going to curse this tree. But if we read it, if we look at the story within its context, with this clearing of the temple, with his criticism of the process of how the temple is used for buying and selling, for commerce, for cheating people, then it might have a different meaning for us. And so we can't, as we go through this, we'll discover that we can't ever completely divide these questions out from themselves. We can't, we can never fully just describe. We're always interpreting when we describe, but we're also adding additional descriptional elements as we interpret. So questions 1 and 2 will wrap into each other. As we get into question 3, what ought to be going on? What is Jesus intending when he does this? That's additionally interpreting, but also attempting to figure out what ought to be going on. What is the intention of this? What does God want us to understand from this or do in relationship to this? And then that's the last question. How do we respond? And so all of these questions, we pull them apart for the sake of studying them. But when we're in a real life situation, and this isn't even a real life situation, we're reading a story in the Bible, but if we're in a real life situation, we're not going to necessarily stop and ask each one of these questions individually in order without circling back and kind of integrating them and jumping from question to question as we attempt to navigate how we're going to respond to the situation, to enact our faith in that situation. So if we go to question 2, the why is this going on, we can look at the context and we can say, well, if the fig tree is acting kind of as a bookend to this episode in the temple, perhaps then the fig tree is a symbol for what happens in the temple. If we do a little bit of research in the what is going, or why is this going on, we will discover that the fig tree in the Bible is often a symbol for the people of Israel. And so if Jesus is cursing this fig tree for not producing fruit, perhaps he isn't just cursing a fig tree. Perhaps he is reminding the people of Israel who it is that they are supposed to be and the fruit that they are supposed to be producing, and they're not doing it. And why aren't they doing it? Because they're so busy buying and selling and turning the temple into a place of commerce rather than into a place of prayer. And then why is prayer so important? Well, when we are in relationship with God in prayer, that is where we get our prayers answered, but that is also where we get the faith that we need to move mountains. So it's all about our faith in God, our relationship with God, allowing God to guide us and allowing God to help us to produce that fruit. So it's a story to teach us a lesson. It's not just Jesus being crazy. And so how do we respond to that? Well, I would say we're supposed to pray. We're supposed to be in relationship with God. We're supposed to wrestle with situations that we need to respond to, but we have to base ourselves in that prayer, in that relationship with God before we act. Because if we have that faith that God gives us as a gift through that relationship, then Jesus says, if we have that faith, we'll be able to move a mountain and throw it into the sea. And so that is the kind of the process in this story of doing all four of those things. But that first question is really challenging, because as soon as I ask the question, what's going on here? Well, I don't know. It seems like Jesus is in a bad mood. That's already interpreting. So you see how it's not a bad thing that we're doing those things. It's just we need to be aware that that's what we're doing. When you ask the question, what's going on here, and then you throw in an interpretation, you're not observing anymore. You're not describing anymore. You're already into the interpretational task. And sometimes in the situation, maybe you do need to step back, and before you start to interpret, say, hey, let's really think about what's happening here, because maybe I'm reading this wrong. Maybe I'm misunderstanding this other person, or maybe I'm misunderstanding the situation, and that might help me to gain some clarity on this. All right.
So in the past, I've often heard, that basically, since people were coming from far away and they had to bring a sacrifice to the temple, there needed to be sellers and traders there. It's just that these people were not being honest about it.
Yeah, so it's an interesting thing, to kind of dive even further into the interpretation and what ought to be going on. These people aren't doing anything wrong in terms of doing commerce in the temple, because if people are coming from far away, they need to be able to buy their sacrifices. They can't bring doves with them from far away when they're walking. They can't bring all these, sheep and goats and all the other kinds of things that they're supposed to bring with them. And so they need to be able to buy the things that they need to sacrifice. They can't, according to the law, use their own regular money from the empire. They also have to change their money so that they can use the temple money to do their exchanges. So again, it's a service. These people are supposed to be helping them. So I think there's the element of, cheating, of attempting to make money off of this. But then there's also possibly, a criticism of the system itself, that is the inaction of your faith in this rote way, in this, going through the motions way. Is that faith, or is that just the empty fig tree that's not producing any fruit? Sure, it's a fig tree. It's sitting there. It's got leaves on it. It's functioning. It's alive. But is it producing fruit? No. Why not? Because it's not focusing on the right thing. It's not in that relationship with God. It's not praying and working on building that faith, deepening that faith so that the fruit can be produced. In the same way that if you're focusing all your attention on doing your sacrifice and going through the motions of your faith, rather than serving the people around you and being aware of the needs that you see and responding to those things, that your faith is going to end up being fruitless as well.
Hey, Katie?
Yeah.
Most of the parables that Jesus tells that we get read at church and stuff, I never get them. Would the people of the time have understood them, or am I just totally clueless? Because there are always some of these parables and I don't get it. And then
Some of them,
like this one, I would have never.
Yeah, some of them yes, some of them no. The people who the people who heard this story would have caught the fig tree element, and the allusion to the people of Israel. If they were Jews reading it. If you're a Gentile reading this, then you wouldn't catch that, and so you might start to get confused by it. But yeah, Jesus, Jesus talks in mysteries, and the parables aren't. They were a little bit less confusing to those people because they understood some of the context of what Jesus was talking about, but it wasn't anything that was completely clear to them either. So we don't need to feel bad because we've got extra layers even of confusion on top of what they had, and they didn't understand it. And we've even got evidence that his disciples, the guys who followed him around and were with him all the time, they didn't understand what he was talking about. So, and he gets upset with them because he's so frustrated with how stupid they are. All right.
Isn't this the same thing today with people who just give money to the church or to a charity or something like that and feel like they've done their part rather than following it up with action that, so it's an empty gesture too. Just give money and not follow it with action.
Yeah, or even, we could suggest maybe that the temple sacrifice system is similar to what we do on Sunday morning. As Lutherans, we don't use the sacrificial imagery as much as the Catholics do, but the service itself, the Mass, is understood in many ways to be a parallel to the sacrificial process of the Jewish temple. And so, we have the altar that we sacrifice on, and we remember Jesus. The Holy Communion is not so much understood as a remembrance, as a meal, as it is a sacrifice. And so you can make those comparisons too if you are interested in moving in that direction and you feel like that's appropriate. That if you go to church on Sunday and then you spend the rest of the week not acting on any of the lessons that you learn and the faith that you're supposed to be developing, and you just go through the motions, are you really a person of God? Are you really faithful? Sure, you do the Sunday morning thing, but is that what it's really about? And this passage might be challenging people in that direction too. All right, so I want to give you an option here for several reasons. I have another passage for us to take a look at. It is the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. And so it has some potentially political elements to it in our day and age, because there are people who use this passage to support their position against homosexuality. And so if we feel like that's a little bit too divisive for us to will cause too much conflict and get in the way of our conversation here, then we don't need to do it. And then the other thing is it's already 7 after 12, and I do want to leave some space for us to talk about our own personal stories. So we can take a look at that a little bit if you'd like, or we can just skip it and I can turn off the recording and we can chat about some of what you feel like you'd like to present to each other.
I don't have any problem doing the reading.
I don't either.
I learned something that we'd never learned before. Good.
Ben, what do you think?
Oh, I have no problem. You can, which way you want to go. I've kind of explained the way I feel about, primary and secondary theology. And I am quite closed-minded in the aspect of the homosexuality problem to a certain degree. We experienced the same thing when we had an interim pastor that came to us, Katie, before you were here. And we, in the call committee, felt like his role was to move us into the new modern church, to get us involved in the modern church. And there was difficulty there. So this is something that, as I say, I have no problem with it. I have a problem with some aspects of it. But I do not get angry or mad or anything. If people wish to discuss, I'm more than willing to help discuss too.
Okay. Well, so what I'd like to do with this passage is look at it from this descriptive task position. This is a passage that has been used for that purpose, but I don't want us to necessarily get into a discussion about whether homosexuality is or isn't appropriate and biblically allowed or anything like that. But I'd like us to look at this passage in particular and see what is going on. What is going on here in this passage, and perhaps you might draw some conclusions for yourself about whether this particular passage anyway does or doesn't appropriately support or reject certain positions on that topic. So I'm not asking us to get into a debate about homosexuality, but I'd like to look at one of these passages related to homosexuality, because I think it is very much misunderstood in the same way that the fig tree story is misunderstood. So asking some of these questions, what is happening here, I think might help us to move in a better direction. And just use this as an example of how we can use these questions in this process to help us to understand when we're reading, when we're encountering other people, etc. So I can read this one. So we're going to start with chapter 19 of Genesis, and looking at verses 1 through 11. So Genesis 19, 1 to 11. Is everybody there?
Were you looking for a reader?
No, I'll read it.
Were you looking for a reader? Because we thought you said you were going to.
Yeah, I can read it. I just wanted to make sure everybody was there. Okay, I'll go ahead and read. I would like to point out too, we're looking at, I'm looking at my Bible, and there is a heading at the start of this chapter that says the depravity of Sodom. And so even those things, as we're looking at our Bibles and we see these headings and the way that they divide out the chapters and things, those are not original. We talked about how the Bible was originally just these Hebrew characters all strung together, not even any spaces. So the way that we divide our Bible, the chapter divisions, the verse divisions, the headings, all of these things are interpretation. So when we come to the Bible, we're already having it interpreted for us in some ways. So sometimes we want to look at that and suggest to ourselves that maybe the way that the person who put this together interpreted it isn't particularly helpful. But that's neither here nor there for this story. So chapter 19, verses 1 through 11. The two angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gateway of Sodom. When Lot saw them, he rose to meet them and bowed down with his face to the ground. He said, "Please, my lords, turn aside to your servant's house and spend the night, and wash your feet. Then you can rise early and go on your way." They said, "No, we will spend the night in the square." But he urged them strongly, so they turned aside to him and entered his house. And he made them a feast and baked unleavened bread, and they ate. But before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people to the last man, surrounded the house. And they called to Lot, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us, so that we may know them." Lot went out the door to the men, shut the door after him, and said, "I beg you, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. Look, I have 2 daughters who have not known a man. Let me bring them out to you, and do to them as you please. Only do nothing to these men, for they have come under the shelter of my roof." But they replied, "Stand back." And they said, "This fellow came here as an alien, and he would play the judge? Now we will deal worse with you than with them." Then they pressed hard against the man Lot and came near the door to break it down. But the men inside reached out their hands and brought Lot into the house with them and shut the door. And they struck with blindness the men who were at the door of the house, both small and great, so that they were unable to find the door. So this question that we're asking today, the descriptive task, what is happening? What is going on?
Yeah, let's see.
don't know. Like, is it because the people were from some other place? I don't really understand this.
So we're not looking for why yet. We're just looking for what. What is happening here?
I've been told this is about hospitality. So he's treating his guests well.
Yeah.
So in that interpretation, what is happening is that these people are trying to take advantage of his guests, and because Lot is the host, he has to protect them.
Mm-hmm.
So basically what we're getting here, I think, as you're all looking at this and trying to decide what to say, is the what of this is a challenge. What is happening here? Well, two men that we claimed that are called angels in the story. So we know that they're angels. Lot probably doesn't know, maybe not, maybe does, but maybe doesn't. Certainly the townspeople don't necessarily know. But Lot encounters these guys and invites them to stay with him. They finally agree to come. He feeds them dinner, but before they can go to bed, the entire town, all the men of the town, come and try to do violence against these men.
That would be my why, why is that happening? Why
Yeah.
you want violent toward-
So then the part that I love the most is Lot goes out there and he says, friends, I can't hand these guys over to you. I'm their host, but I'll give you my daughters instead, and you can do what you want with them.
Oh. Yeah.
Awful.
So, we get
Yeah.
this.
We have a
get
hard
this-
time with that one.
Yeah, so we get this very confusing story. What is going on here? What is happening? Even to answer that question is very challenging. But then when we get into the why is this happening? Well, gosh, is it because every single man in Sodom is gay and wants to sleep with these particular people? Is it because they want to be violent because they don't like them because they're from out of town? Is it because they're just so evil that that they want to kill everybody around them or want to do some kind of violence to everybody around them? We don't know. There isn't enough information here to tell us any of that. And so I chose this passage because it's really challenging, and I know that it has this extra stickiness because of the issue that people still continue to wrestle with. But I don't think that it's obvious from reading this that that's even what's going on in this passage. I don't know that this passage can help us to figure out whether homosexual relationships should or can be accepted in the church, because this doesn't have anything to do with a relationship. It has to do with rape. It has to do with violence. It has to do with attempting to violate the safety of these men and of Lot and of his family. But when we come to a passage like this with an assumption about how we already know what it's about, we already have answered question number 3, what ought to be going on here? What is God's message from this? When we come to it from that assumption, then we read into it some things that aren't necessarily there. And I'm not trying to tell you, what to have your opinion about on this particular topic. There are other passages in the Bible that you can certainly look at and come to conclusions either way. But I don't think that this particular passage has anything to do with that. But when we come to it without asking question number 1, what is going on here, then we really miss out on being able to understand completely what's happening. And I think that can happen to us in our own lives too, when we're trying to wrestle with how to respond faithfully to a particular situation that we get ourselves in. When we come to it with the assumption that we already know the answer to number 3, then we skip over questions 1 and 2. We skip over the what is going on here. We've already made our decision. We've already judged what's going on here. And so we miss out, and we potentially miss out on doing the faithful thing because we haven't gone through the whole process and really asked these questions of ourselves or of the person we're trying to work with or help. Any thoughts on responses to that?
So the only interpretation of what the men in the village were after is the reference to his daughters.
Well, so mine says, where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us so that we may know them. Other passages, other translations say, bring them out so that we might have sex with them. So there is that element of it, that there is some kind of at least allusion to a sexual act. But
what was the original language?
Hebrew?
Well, I mean, like, what was the original wording? Was it sex or getting to know them, or is there any clue there?
Yeah, let me,
It's relations.
now you got me pulling books off the shelf, Pam.
Sorry.
No, but this is the second task. Sometimes you have to do some research to figure out why something is happening, or why is this going on this way. Hi there, faithful listeners. This is Katie. I am recording this after the session. I just wanted to let you know that the reason why our session abruptly ended just now was because it took me a little while to find the answer to Pam's question about the Hebrew. There is some very complicated Hebrew grammar stuff and spelling stuff that goes into it, but I finally found the answer to the question. And the verb that is used there is literally to know. So getting to know someone, God knows our innermost thoughts, things like that. But the knowledge of someone in a carnal sense, knowing someone in the biblical sense, as we use the euphemism today, is one of the potential meanings of that word. And so that kind of adds an additional wrinkle to how we understand and describe what is going on in that passage about Sodom. So some additional food for thought there for you. And then additionally, in the rest of our session, we also opened up the floor for people to share their personal stories so that we could start to practice doing that descriptive task, that answering that question, what is going on, and then start to look at some of the other questions as well. And I felt that those conversations should remain within the holy space of our session. So I hope that you'll be able to join us next week for our session on question number 2, why is this going on, the interpretive task, so that you can be part of the entire conversation. But if not, there will be another recording of the introductory material and some of the Bible study for you to listen to next week as well. I hope you're all well. Let me know if you have any questions or comments or anything like that. And I hope to see you soon. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.